You know what they say, how you spend your days is how you spend your life. And I guess that's why I've always loved taking time to consider what tools I'll need throughout the year to help me engage in the practices that will build a life of truth, goodness, and beauty. It can be easy to get swept up in the consumer side of a new year, I know. But remember that when we consider how a thing changes, as in what Aristotle calls the four causes, the material cause is important. Have we made it inordinately important in our modern day? Probably. But is it important nonetheless? Yes. So ask yourself, honestly, what material tools are needed to help me change? And consider those. With that said, is there anything better than a new notebook? The first fill of an ink pen? The perfectly weighted bookmark? There definitely are, but these are still some of my favorite things. While my practices haven't changed too much over the last few years, my tools have. Maybe you remember that last year I tried my hand at drawing out my weekly planner and using a traveler's journal. The year before that, it was a color-coded golden coil journal as I started living by the rhythms of the liturgical year. The year before that, there was a 3-month span with a monk manual, but mostly an 8-year stretch with moleskin planners. Here's what I'm using this year. I do want to share that my mug, while not explicitly a tool for the year, is a simple joy of mine. I use it daily, and it was made by Claire Sandvig, a tremendous ceramicist. Let's take a spin through the odds and ends used every day. The inkwell, the case my husband affectionately refers to as my pen purse, and my timer. I bought myself a fountain pen about a year ago, and it took about 20 seconds for me to form an allegiance to it. It scratches the paper in a satisfying way, demanding to be held just so. It's almost like I'm the only one for whom it'll work, and so everyone who tries it fails to write beautifully, and in that way, I feel like a magician. So with the pen comes the ink, and yes, it does leave ink smudges on my fingers, making me feel every bit a Jo March. But Jo March, admittedly, didn't use highlighters, and as you'll soon see, I do in my Mother Academia notebook. I'm a sucker for color coding. These midliner highlighter colors are aesthetically pleasing and good at highlighting. Lastly, you'll see my brass bookmarks. After many a comment from trouble-hearted viewers, I am no longer dog-earing my antique book pages. If you're new here, I have a knack for acquiring beautiful classic books as the current home librarian. I also have a knack for dog-earing pages to return to during my Commonplace practice. But the internet yelled at me, and now I use bookmarks and book darts. So, shall we hop into my Mary Poppins pile of notebooks? The first two should be recognizable as my mother's diary and my logbook. I've not changed either in years. I use a simple traveler's journal for my mother's diary, which is a practice of Charlotte Mason homeschool mothers to keep regular notes on our children's growth and challenges. It helps with our thinking love. The logbook is the record of what we accomplish each day in our homeschool lessons. I use an extra large moleskin notebook and have detailed this notebook and my planning practices in Common House many a time. So last year, I tried my hand at a mix of bullet journaling and traveler's journals. I had okay results. I loved the quality of this notebook, but I hated having to pull the notebooks out in order to write well in them. Having everything together was a plus, but ultimately, it wasn't for me. And that's okay. You can try and change things. I think moms especially like to make things finite and final because we want to succeed, control, and accomplish. But being able to apply eternal principles and living ideas to ever-changing circumstances is the virtue of prudence. Your practices may not be taking you in the direction of your telos, another philosophical angle on this, which simply means your chief end or purpose. And so to grow in wisdom might mean to change something, like your notebook. Yeah, I get philosophical about notebooks. So on to the big heavy hitter this year. This is the Monk Manual Weekly Planner. You'll first see the monthly spreads. For each month, you assess how things are going in various areas of your life, relationships, work, health, and so on. You can choose a theme or a focus, which helps you shape what you do or don't do over the course of the month. It's almost like a mini rule of life, which is a monastic practice I love and use. And that's the thing about the Monk Manual. It steals the wisdom of monastic practices for the modern person. So then we pop to the weekly page. Once again, you can note your theme, your weekly tracked habit, your priorities, to-dos, and so on. But my favorite bit is the daily box for gratitude and the daily box for insight. I've spoken about my tiny mercy lists before, but the practice of gratitude is one that shapes the narrative of your life, the story you tell about God, yourself, and your daily happenings. Pausing each day to write down a single point of gratitude is a practice for everyone, and I just love that it's in my planner. At the end of each week, there's a spread for reflections, insights, memorable moments, notes, and such. Like I said at the top, the way we spend our days is the way we spend our lives, and yet, too often, our lives feel as if they're flying by and we're not intentionally choosing anything. Life is happening to us, and not in a way we necessarily enjoy. But having a weekly pause to reflect helps you plan and act the next week in an intentional way. You don't need a monk manual to do this, but it might be a practice worth taking with you into 2024. Now, this beautiful notebook might look familiar to those of you who read Andrew Lang's fairy books. This is my 2024 Commonplace book, and the cover is based on Lang's Olive Fairy book. It's a simple online notebook with pages weighty enough to handle my fountain pen. I've spoken on Commonplace books before, but most simply, it's a place to record quotes from what you read or listen to, so you can revisit them repeatedly. There's a lot to say about the formative practice of writing down noble, lovely, inspiring ideas, or even really funny or clever ones, but I think it's summed up in the practice of humility. Each time you sit down to thumb back through your books and slowly copy the words by hand into your own notebook, you submit yourself to the wisdom of the past, or of others presently. You recognize you do not know everything. You have things to learn, and you have to put in effort to grow. Now, this is my work notebook, which, yes, is also called the Commonplace because, yes, I really love commonplacing that much. I never try to be original here. I much prefer sitting at the table of the great conversation and passing down the ideas worth inheriting as persons. So my work is based pretty much on what's in my Commonplace book, and that's how the name works. But for the Commonplace, I do all of my work by hand until it's time to put the work online. I write my podcast scripts, Common House resource outlines, video notes, everything by hand first. 1, I think it humanizes the work on my end, and 2, I think it ultimately humanizes the work for you on your end, and 3, I can work anywhere. I don't like to work on my computer in front of my children, but I often have pockets of time to write down ideas, parts of podcasts, and what have you. Since I usually use books instead of Google to do my work, I can throw my resources and my workspace into my bag or onto the kitchen counter, and it becomes part of my normal life rhythms in a way the computer machine never could. The next one is a new notebook for me this year, my Mother Academia notebook. This year, rather than doing my usual literary life, I've charted a formal course of study to focus on classical studies, medieval studies, and Latin. As part of it, I'm keeping a narration notebook, and this is it. It's a simple setup. I narrate whatever I've just read without worrying about keeping each book's narrations together. That folded piece of paper, that's how I keep track of my weekly Latin vocabulary. So while I translate a few sentences from Augustus, I'll ask you to note my timer. As I recently told Common House in a video about how I use Notion to organize all the things, I'll tell you I adore this timer. Regardless of how long you set it, it fills to 100%. For a recovering to-do list checker like myself, this is a visual reminder that there is a proper time to do each thing, and that is the only time proper to do it. I can no longer work endlessly to fully complete anything. I have young kids, and it's just not my season of life. But I do have proper time to make progress by faithfully doing the work in the right time. And while it's just a timer to some, to me, it's a reminder of submitting to the boundary lines God has given me in this season of life, because they're meant to be pleasing. And hopefully that's an inspiring idea for you in 2024. So this is the spread of my 2024 notebooks for motherhood, home management, homeschooling, commonplacing, and Mother Academia. And I really do think that days filled with these practices will make a pretty good year.